are these people?
So we're going to start off, for me, as I said earlier, this is a local story. But as I said, the implications, in terms of what DC is doing could have an effect, I would argue, in other cities as well, depending on how successful this is. So this has been a talk about for DC for the last few months, I would say. But yesterday, the DC Council voted to pass what they call a public safety bill, but it's known colloquially here as the crime bill. So this has been somewhat controversial, and attitudes about this bill are very mixed, and you can probably guess as to why. But I do want to kind of give information about it because I definitely have some thoughts on it. And like I said, in terms of thinking about this, obviously this is a local story for me. But what I was sharing with you earlier and what I was sharing with Indy earlier this afternoon, this could be a bad this kind of shows that we're kind of going backwards in terms of thinking in terms of how we deal with crime overall in this country, but also the implications of this, you could see this potentially in other cities as well, depending on the situation of how they deal with crime,
Right.
in other places around the country. So I think this could mark of a statute that may not be good in terms of how we deal with crime in the country in general and who this affects. And you can probably guess who this will mostly affect. So this is from not New York Times, Washington Post, article written by Megan Flynn and Pete Herman, where they write DC Council passes emergency public safety legislation, which the idea, like how they phrase it, is like public safety, like, so we got to clean it up a little bit, just to make it a little more manageable for the rich folks. But they write, oops. The DC Council yesterday passed emergency public safety legislation as the city weathers a violent summer, establishing a new crime for firing a gun in public and making it easier for judges to detain people charged with violent crimes before trial, a provision that drew extended debate. The legislation proposed by Councilmember Brooke Pinto passed 12-1 with opposition from Councilmember Janice Lewis George. It will be in effect for 90 days after the mayor signs it. Pinto's bill is similar to a proposal put forth by Mayor Muriel E. Bowser that lawmakers are expected to debate in the fall, but Pinto said some provisions could not wait as the city confronts rising homicides and carjackings. This legislation today is a major step forward in our effort to create a safer DC for all residents, and it cannot wait, Pinto said. I want to say to families, businesses, partners of the district, we hear you and we know we need to do more to keep you safe. Pinto's proposition garnered broad support despite escalating tension between the Bowser administration and members of the DC Council, particularly Chairman Phil Mendelssohn, about who is to blame for the rising crime in DC and what should be done to reduce it. Mendelssohn reiterated Tuesday that he believes police improving their closure rates and prosecutors acting more aggressively would have a more significant impact on crime than any council legislation. But he said he was tired of a public perception, which he said was perpetuated by the mayor, that the DC Council wasn't taking crime seriously. Hold on to that.
Okay.
Bowser had taken aim at the council a day earlier, noting a previous vote to cut the police department's budget several years ago. I'm angry, and I'm angry because The council is being blamed, Mendelsohn said, describing a perception that the council does not care. I think there are things the mayor can do outside legislation with regard to public safety, and she's not doing it. Today's legislation is useful, and let me be clear, I am not criticizing the police. But what angers me is I think our citizenry is being misled. Crime fighting is primarily a function of the executive branch, the police, and other law enforcement agencies. Councilmember Nadine K. Nadeau echoed Mendelsohn's remarks. Bowser, she suggested, can ask DC police why they're not patrolling equitably across the city, or provide data on what they're doing, or ask why the U.S. attorney is declining 2/3 of cases. I want to reiterate, this council is united in addressing public safety issues, and will continue to do it. So, thoughts so far?
I
Before
mean, they gonna throw stop and frisk in this too, or?
no, I'll no. But the idea is just given that,
Yeah.
and this is kind of the issue with Bowser. Um, we had a couple of DC council members who were not. They said it. They feel like she's not doing enough,
Right.
but yet still, this bill was, and I'll talk more about it later. But essentially, this bill was basically forced through quickly. So the vote happened yesterday, and there really hasn't been a lot of discussion on it, publicly, in terms of what the council was planning to do in regard to the rising crime rate in the city. And I would argue there are reasons why crime is rising, but those issues are not necessarily being addressed.
Yeah.
But we'll get more into that later. So
Okay.
to continue, a spokeswoman for Bowser did not immediately respond to a request for comment on the criticisms leveled at the mayor. For her part, Bowser celebrated the passage of the legislation. Our community is in agreement that the status quo is unacceptable, she said in a statement, added that no one should be afraid to let their children play outside or walk to the bus stop for fear of crime. The legislation that the council passed today will fill gaps in our criminal justice system, and in doing so, will increase accountability for violent and criminal behavior and make our cities safer. Despite some frustration at Bowser, council members said they were united on the need to take urgent action as violence escalates in its city. They agreed with almost all provisions of Pinto's legislation, with the exception of one impassioned objection from Louis George to the changes regarding pretrial detention. Mendelsohn and other members who initially voiced skepticism about Bowser's legislation, dubbed Safer, Stronger, warned to Pinto's similar proposal as she narrowed some provisions involving pretrial detention for juveniles and changed or eliminated others. Bowser, who had described Pinto's bill as retaining the heart of the bill, had urged the council to support it. Pinto's bill, the Prioritizing Public Safety Emergency Amendment Act, expands access to private security cameras through an incentive program and allows pretrial GPS monitoring data to be used in evidence against defendants, among several other provisions. So what does that sound like to you?
I mean, safer, stronger sounds dumb already.
Right. But the idea of expanding access to private security cameras through an
Oh,
incentive program.
yeah, that sounds like surveillance, is what it sounds like.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, cool.
Yes.
Surveillance is a thing, you know?
Surveillance is a thing.
So,
um, it also creates new crimes, including endangerment with a firearm and then strangulation offense. Such charges had previously been included in the revised Criminal Code Act that Congress blocked from going into effect. But the provisions that drew the most debate centered on the circumstances under which defendants could be detained as they await trial. Pinto's proposal would have judges presume that adults charged with violent crimes and juveniles charged with certain offenses should be detained. Defendants would have an opportunity to argue against that determination, with Pinto stressing that judges are not mandated to detain anyone. So,
What is the point at all?
right, what is the point at all? What about the idea of due process?
No, essentially, he's put the due process in the hands of a judge. That's what he's
Right,
saying.
right. Well, she.
She. Yes.
She.
It's the judge gets to
But
decide whether you stay in jail or not here,
right.
or can leave.
Lewis Right. Louis George proposed an amendment which failed, striking the entire provision that would create a presumption that adults charged with violent offenses be detained pre-trial, saying it needed more time and scrutiny.
Mm.
Louis George pointed to pre-trial data and suggested the legislation will not substantially help reduce crime. According to a December report from the Pretrial Services Agency, 88% of adults released pretrial remained arrest-free over the last 5 years, and under 2% were charged with a violent offense while out. Louis George argued that during the meeting Tuesday that expanded a presumption of pretrial detention to all violent crimes would mark a dramatic change to the district's law, repeating mistakes of the tough on crime past and depriving defendants of due process.
Yes, what you
The
said.
current law only has judges apply that presumption in particular circumstances, such as cases in which a person is charged with committing a violent or dangerous offense while armed or out awaiting trial in another case. Otherwise, a judge must find clear and convicting evidence that keeps a person in jail is the only way to keep the community safe and ensure their appearance at trial. So, as you said, basically,
Yep.
the judge can put them in jail really for whatever reason, and they don't necessarily have to have all the evidence in order to prove it. So, what happens when you're locked up pre-trial? You have the potential of losing housing. If you're a parent, you have the potential of your children being taken from you. If you have a job, you have the potential of being fired, Louis George said. All I'm asking for my colleagues to do, we can address this on a permanent basis, but the evidence does not suggest we need to do this on an emergency basis. Councilmember Matthew Furin similarly said that he worried Pinto's proposal was casting an overbroad net by expanding the pretrial detention presumption to all violent crimes, and that it was all happening too fast. He suggested the legislation should focus on crimes that were on the rise, but he ultimately opposed Louis George's amendment and voted for the legislation anyway.
Oh, of course he did. Okay.
This really is a hard one, he said. I have quite a lot of sympathy for the argument that Janice Louis George was making, but I also do think I wish we were not doing this on an emergency basis, but as an emergency. Okay. Only
Is
one
it?
council member. Don't worry, I'm going to get into this.
Okay.
Only one council member, Vincent C. Gray, participating virtually and without commenting on his position, supported Louis George amendment. Pinto's proposal went further than the mayor's Safety Stronger bill with respect to expanding pretrial detention. The mayor's proposal would have expanded the presumption of pretrial detention to cases in which a person with a violent criminal conviction was charged with a new violent offense.
Okay.
Go ahead.
No, you're good. I was just. Yep.
But Pinto's proposal called for more limited pretrial detention of juveniles compared with Bowser's, assuaging some of the objections to the mayor's legislation.
Wait.
No.
Bowser wanted juveniles to be detained pre-trial in virtually all cases.
Yes.
To be detained pre-trial. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Sure. Okay.
Bowser wanted juveniles to be detained pre-trial in virtually all cases in which a judge found substantial probability they committed a violent or dangerous crime, regardless of whether the juvenile was alleged to be armed, as the law now requires. In perhaps the most controversial provision, the mayor proposed detaining juveniles in some cases for their own protection, even if they pose no danger to the community. DC Attorney General Brian L. Schwab argued the proposal was not backed up by data and will not make the community safer.
Of course
Though
not.
on Tuesday, he celebrated Pinto's legislation as better and more targeted.
Well,
okay.
We're boned.
Pinto's emergency bill added only specific crimes for which children would face a presumption of pretrial detention if they were not accused of being armed. Those crimes include murder, first-degree sexual assault, carjacking, or assault with intent to commit any of those offenses. Juveniles would also face a presumption of pretrial detention if they were charged with committing a violent offense while armed.
Yeah.
The DC Police Union, which has lambasted the council as anti-police after it passed the sweeping police reform bill, applauded passage of the legislation on Tuesday and Pinto's leadership of it.
Well, you know what that means. Like, if the cops like it, you know.
Well, don't worry. I'm going to tear this apart.
Yeah.
Well, you can figure that anyway. It is a breath of fresh air to see the city council actually introducing and passing some common sense, logical bills that move in the direction of holding criminals accountable, the chairman, Gregory Penterton, said in a statement. Passage of the legislation comes as the district continues to struggle with violent crime, up 33% this year over last, driven by spikes in homicides and robberies. Carjackings also continue to rise. 140 incidents in June were the most in a single month in at least 5 years. Crime during the pandemic rose in cities across the country and has started to drop recently in some categories, though it has not fully retreated to levels before coronavirus-related shutdowns. DC is bucking the trend.
Oh, God. Okay.
Police in DC said the city has recorded 129 homicides this year, up 17% from this time last year. The city is on pace for 200 or more homicides for the first consecutive year and is moving close to what might be the highest yearly total in 2 decades. Killings, meanwhile, have fallen in Philadelphia, Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, and Baltimore. Okay, actually, so we'll stop there for a second. So, so that was a lot to go through.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what are your thoughts?
I mean, there's a lot. Yeah, I mean, they want to detain minors. Like, this, of course, all in legal speak, right? So it's like politician speak, right? So it's like detained in pretrial. That could mean quite a bit of stuff, you know. Like, what does that entail specifically for them? I don't quite know, but you know, I imagine it involves steel bars and a key of some degree. Right. So now, granted, they're prefacing it with violent crimes, right? But essentially, they also allowed the judge to detain you for anything,
right?
Regardless of if it's a violent crime or not. And he doesn't even have to hold you for a violent crime. He can decide to not. So when do you get it? The issue is when do you, this is pre-trial, right? So when do they even give you a judge to decide whether to be detained or not? So then they're going to have to detain you for anything, like, until that's figured out, right? I don't know. There's a lot of like unanswered questions on this, so I'll be interested to see what like pre-conviction, pre-trial, like whatever they're deeming this to be part of. But yeah, it's very crime billy, like 3 strikes, go to federal prison, do not collect $200, you know.
I'm going to jail.
Like, just straight to jail, pretty much.
Yeah, that's basically what it is, to me, at least that section of the bill.
Yeah.
But 2 things for me that just kind of came out of this.
Yeah.
This is a backlash to defund the police.
Sure.
Straight up. This is an immediate backlash, I think, especially from DC police and probably some other folks who were pressured to move away from that.
Yeah.
So, so this is, and they're kind of faulting the defund the police movement in terms of,
well, that's the reason why crime has risen. But
right.
Guess what, bitch? Coronavirus.
Right. We're not talking about the idea of, that one, we're in a pandemic, and two, we're in the middle, and I'm going to keep saying it. We are basically in a recession. Like, people are saying we're not in a recession yet. I'll argue we're in it right now.
Worse. We might be in
Right.
worse than that.
Right.
They just don't talk about it. Like all those things that you hear when we had the last recession about banks giving money to particular things, Congress made it to where they don't have to ask anymore. And they don't have to tell us that they do that anymore. But they're doing it almost all the time. Like what is that called? Quantitative easing. Right? Like that's what's happening. They're giving billions and billions of dollars to the banks. Like right now because of that. Just to fudge the numbers. Printing money. Money printer go burr.
This is a straight up this is a hard backlash regarding defund the police movement, number one. Number two, this whole thing, and I said this to you earlier, like before we went live, this gives me 90s crime bill vibes to me.
Oh yeah.
This whole thing. And I'll say why, just given history, in terms of what they're proposing and how they went about it. Because like I said, this was done as an emergency legislation that they did it yesterday because they went on the council went on summer recess starting today. So they wanted to get this done before they essentially get on vacation. And shout out to Money Oakley. I know she did a video on this regarding student debt, but what she was kind of saying kind of applies here.
Yeah.
Whenever politicians want to push legislation that they know is not going to be popular with the public, they'll do it at an inconvenient time.
Yeah.
So in this case, they did it I wouldn't say last minute, but they marked it as an emergency the day before that they went on summer recess and during the summer when many people are on vacation. So they're not going to not enough people were going to be around to really critique and call out a lot of this stuff publicly.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
So they just rushed it through without really going through, I think, the proper details and channels and speaking to the right research and doing the right research. Actually, I would argue they probably did. They just didn't care about it because they were looking for political expediency. Because I'm fairly sure a lot of this stems from the idea, like, the lower income wards have been complaining about crime probably since a tale as old as time. But it's now getting to the point where the richer wards are seeing some of this and they're making noise about it. So this is more a political expediency to kind of say, oh, we did something. We're solving the problem, which is just a Band-Aid in terms of you're not really addressing the true issues here.
And hasn't DC been one of the highest paid police like groups in the country? Like
I can't say for sure, but
I heard Afeni say that at one point.
Yes. It wouldn't surprise me if that's the case.
Yeah.
So I just happened to get this article. I'm not going to read all of it, but this is from the Center of American Progress. Didn't think I would ever read anything for the Center of American Progress. Written by Ed Chung. So he wrote this 4 years ago, where he writes, the 1994 crime bill continues to undercut justice reform. Here's how to stop it. So he wrote, come on.
I'm going to zoom this.
There we go. Yes, you do. The legacy of the Violent Crime Control Act and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, better known as the Crime Bill, has reemerged in the national debate around criminal justice reform and public safety. Keep in mind, this was written back in 2019.
Right.
Many consider the Crime Bill to be one of the cornerstone statutes that accelerated mass incarceration. But the law's negative effects did not end there. States and localities were incentivized for a massive infusion of federal funding to build more jails and prisons and to pass so-called truth in sentencing laws and other punitive measures that simultaneously increase the number and length of prison sentences while reducing the possibility of early release for those incarcerated. It has been well documented that these policies were failures. The cost to society came not only from the staggering amount of taxpayer dollars that were invested in enforcement, but also from the disproportionate incarceration of a generation of African American men in the name of public safety.
Thanks,
Moreover, tough on crime measures, specifically longer incarceration sentences, have at best a marginal effect on improving public safety. Elected leaders today are attempting to unwind some of the most harmful effects of the crime bill through criminal justice reform measures. As part of that reform effort, a number of cities have pursued public health models and community-based strategies alongside innovative policing approaches. However, the effectiveness of those efforts have been and will continue to be muted because the machinery that the crime bill created and persevered has never stopped churning. The same funding streams that overwhelm support enforcement activities, overproven preventative and restorative solutions continue to this day, albeit with tweaks around the edges. States still look to build new jails and prison facilities, even as crime rates remain near historic lows. At the same time, Congress continues to advocate for new criminal statutes and higher criminal penalties, even as it proposes to lower some of the mandatory minimum sentences.
Yep.
So I read all of that because in light of this, and what I'm going to say here is very speculative. I can't confirm this. I don't know this to be true. My guess is, especially given that it was almost unanimous that the DC Council voted for this bill, even as we said in the article, some people had issues with it. I have to wonder and question whether there was or is a financial incentive for them to do
it. Absolutely.
I have to wonder that. And as I said, given what we know from the 1994 crime bill, it stands to reason to me that they were under, and this is why I said to you off camera.
Right.
So I'll say it here. And again, this is speculation. The real estate industry in DC is very powerful. Right now, and I'm not going to say where I live, but I live in one of the more gentrified neighborhoods in DC currently.
It's free real estate.
But a lot of that real estate, a lot of that development now is moving east. Now, if you live in DC, we have an area called East of the River. When you say East of the River, that basically means colloquially the hood.
Yeah.
So right now, a lot of the development is starting to trickle into those neighborhoods. And I'm sure that many of these real estate development companies do not want that crime there in order to lower the investments that they're making. So I'm pretty sure that a lot of this is based on corporate interest in terms of the development that is occurring in the city, that basically I'll say it, bribed Bowser to be like, take care of this. And basically the other councilmen basically followed suit because they don't want that backlash necessarily, from the community or from these corporate donors. And only one woman had the balls to actually say no. So, and even online, I'm beginning to see that people, because she's up for re-election this year, that there are a lot of people now that are kind of calling for her head right now because she voted against this bill. So, so that's why I'm thinking that there is a lot more to this than what the Washington Post is saying. And again, what I said
Well,
is
and this
just
is also, it's also election cycles coming up, right? When's Mayor Bowser up for re-election?
She just got reelected this past fall. So she's pretty much good, but that doesn't
now
mean
she's got to pay off her debts pretty much.
Right.
Yeah. So that's also the case. I figured it was one of those things where it's like, I got to appear like I'm dealing with crime by doing this stuff, So, but it's just her being super greedy.
You greedy dirtbag.
Greedy as shit.
Yeah. So this brings me no pleasure to doing this, but so yesterday after this vote, got an email from one of our councilmen, Zachary Parker. Zachary, I actually once upon a time, I lived in the apartment building that he also lived. Actually, we lived down the hall from each other. I volunteered for his campaign when he was running for the State Board of Ed. So that's my relationship to him. So he knows who I am, and I've spoken about the education issues in DC over the last few years for Power Ed, so he's very familiar with who I am. He just got elected to councilman this past fall. He was one of the people that did vote for this bill, which upset quite a few people in his ward. So he came out with this email yesterday, I guess, to do some damage control. And I'm sorry to say it, but this is what this seems like to me. So I'm going to read part of it, because now he's kind of trying to justify, he's basically trying to justify why he voted this way.
Right.
So he writes, there has been a lot of confusion about the Prioritizing Public Safety Emergency Amendment Act of 2023. So I wanted to take this opportunity to explain what it is, what it's not, and why I voted for it. First, the legislation is not the same as the Safer, Stronger legislation proposed by the mayor, although it includes some provisions from the mayor's bill. I mean, yeah.
Sure.
Rather, the bill we voted on today is modest and targeted. That remains to be seen.
Yeah, it can be sweeping, depending on the precedent.
It focuses on significant gaps or challenges presented by existing law. Second, this legislation has changed significantly since Councilmember Pinto reintroduced it last Thursday. So keep that in mind. This was introduced last week and was voted on yesterday.
Yeah, that's fast.
In
government time.
I mean, that local government, even just like
yeah.
Like, but this just kind of shows, like, again, this is local politics. But if they want something done, anything that they want to have done that benefits them or their donors, it will go through real quick. Anything that is done in relative to us,
wait a long periodically time.
Thank you. Right. Anyway, continue. Continue, please.
Yeah. There we go.
Did I read the second part?
Maybe. Yes.
Zoom in.
Yeah.
No, I didn't. Oh yeah, well, I didn't finish it. Second, this legislation has changed significantly since the Councilmember Pinto introduced it last week. I was originally concerned about the section modifying standards for the pretrial detention of juveniles being too broad. In partnership with colleagues, I worked with Councilmember Pinto to focus this section only on the most violent offenses. I also voted for amendments to the bill offered by Council members Robert Wright and Charles Allen that improved the legislation with regards to the district's crime-related data collection efforts. Okay.
Is it clear? There you go.
There we go. Third, the legislation is an emergency legislation, meaning that it is limited to 90 days. While my colleagues and I embrace the urgent need to make targeted changes to our laws needed to reduce violent crime in the district, we also understand the need to revisit these decisions before considering them in permanent legislation. So I just want to clarify, this is limited.
Well,
but that's not to say they're not going to keep it.
Right. So the way these usually happen is it's not permanent, and then they just slide through on a rider or something else that you don't notice to extend this,
right. So it's not like if you put it in as an emergency bill that you're just going to remove it.
Right.
You put it in with the intention of keeping it in or keeping it in some fashion. So the question is, what parts are you going to keep? Or what are you going to take out? So he doesn't say all of that, though. But anyway, he continues, I will continue to engage neighbors to ensure we strike the right balance. The bigger picture. Some have pointed out that the emergency legislation adopted today does not address the vital and urgent work pertaining to underlying and systemic issues that exacerbate public safety.
And that would be right. Yes.
I am mindful that even robust administration of our criminal laws has its limits. If we are truly going to build the healthy, safe communities we all crave, we need to think more critically about the chain of events that leads to an individual picking up a gun and engaging in a violent act in the first place. So you're right, Zach. You're absolutely right. So why not take the time to do that? So why I support this bill today, I do not consider it the beginning or the end of this body's work to advance public safety. Neighbors are tired of the violence, and so am I. I look forward to robust oversight of the agencies responsible to enforcing our laws. You're right. I look forward to continued conversations about refocusing MPD police on its core crime-fighting responsibilities while embracing civilian public safety rules where they make sense. And I look forward to the hard, important work of interrupting the cycles of exclusion, underinvestment, and disillusionment that plagues district communities where violence is particularly prevalent. Yeah, so it just sounds like a lot of platitudes there to kind of justify. I'm not sure. No, I didn't put it here, but he did continue in this email saying that he has bills that kind of address some of the systematic issues.
Yeah.
But they've just been introduced. Nothing has moved in terms of any of those. So yeah, so like I said, I just feel like for him, this is just basically to backtrack and justify why he voted this way. But as I said, if you make it a law, it's going to be extremely difficult to remove it or at least take out the things that initially that you're going to have in there. If anything, you're going to add more to it, you know? So, but anyway, so there were a lot of people, and this was kind of the weird thing on Twitter. There was a lot of people who were very happy about this bill, which actually, just as an aside, was very strange on Twitter. I said I wasn't on Twitter today, but I kind of was, because I just saw what looked like to be bots around this issue in DC, just basically being like, just hyper focused on, that was basically all of their threads were, just this issue and crime in general, which I thought very strange.
Yeah, like,
but
who the fuck's gonna, like, who?
Right, but it was just the idea of like, who is setting up these bot farms to really push the idea that people are happy for this?
The police union.
Yeah.
Like, we're gonna start going down our rabbit holes, you know?
Right. But that being said, were some critiques regarding this bill, if you can zoom in.
Yep.
For me. So this is written by Joshua A. Miller, who wrote, "It's super uncomfortable that in an era where most cities are questioning cash bail and trying to reduce pretrial detention, DC is looking to increase the number of people we incarcerate pretrial. And it's going to be expensive."
Oh, of course it is.
Right. So more pretrial incarceration will further harm our communities without making our communities safer.
Yep.
So he continues, pretrial detention is prior to conviction. The fact that we can't convict even half the folks we arrest for illegal guns suggests that we shouldn't automatically be locking them up while it gets resolved. They're not likely to be convicted. It doesn't make us safer. Less than 2% of those released pretrial are arrested for another violent crime. Police shouldn't get a rebuttal presumption that for something that happens 2% of the time, especially when they lack evidence to convict 60% of the time.
Yeah, unless your skin color is different. But yeah.
Of course, prosecutors already detain folks pretrial. They just have to show it's necessary for public safety. And for adults, that's usually not so hard if there's probable cause they committed a violent crime with a firearm.
Mm-hmm.
The new bill would allow prosecutors to detain someone pretrial for crimes like pickpocketing. It's really broad because of how the DC Code defines crimes of violence. This was something
I didn't even think about. This isn't the judge. This is the prosecutors get to decide.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Yeah.
Like. Yeah, that's even worse.
Right. This was something we were trying to fix in the revised criminal code. So it just shows that. Actually, did I put? Yeah, actually. Everyone knows the politician's fallacy, right? Something must be done. This is something we can do. Therefore, we must do this. Most of this bill is unresponsive to real crime prevention and crime-solving needs, but it counts as doing something.
Yep. Well, I mean, think about protesters. They deem those to be violent, whatever. Like, what did the Cop City kids get charged with? Like, terrorism, right? Something dumb like that. Yeah.
Right.
This would be the same thing. In DC, where what happens frequently? Like, Okay.
So, I'm gonna play this Vin. Real quick. Forgot her name. I think she doesn't say her name here, but she also has some words regarding this.
Frankie Centric on TikTok.
Okay, yeah.
Apparently. This little video here you want?
Yeah.
We cannot incarcerate our way out of wealth disparity and economic crisis. Today, DC Council passed legislation in an attempt to address the public safety issues that we're having in our city. We can all agree that we want the violence in DC to stop. Something has to be done. But what is not the answer is contributing to mass incarceration. This bill expands access to private security cameras. What is not the answer is increasing police power and surveillance, and will eventually lead to more pretrial detention. Being held pretrial means that you have not been convicted of a crime. What is not the answer is using these same methods that have been used for decades and expecting different results. Pretrial detention is a violent practice. It rips people away from their family, away from their livelihood, dehumanizes people and puts them in cages, and exposes them to the trauma of jail itself. We here at Court Watch DC believe that the weaponization of crime itself is a social harm.
Yep. Social harm.
Yeah. I have one more tweet, and this tweet, shout out to Allison Horn, I think basically sums up everything that I would have wanted to say otherwise regarding this. But she tweeted, "If there were an easy way to legislate our way to public safety, we would have done it ages ago. If incarceration made us safe, DC would be just about the safest place in the world. Cutting corners and chasing silver bullets is a shameful approach. We deserve so much better."
Yep.
We know what causes crime: poverty, inequality, gaps in resources and opportunities, hopelessness. If you're doubling down on the same flawed and ineffective policies that brought us mass incarceration and a generation of fatherless teens, you're harming more than you're helping. If you're willing to spend hundreds of thousands of taxpayer dollars to incarcerate a child, but unwilling to pay the children in the Marion Valley Summer Youth Employment Program more than $6.25 an hour, you aren't serious about creating and sustaining public safety in DC. Now, this is another aside, because people were like, oh, teens, there's this program that they can apply and get a job over the summer so they won't get in trouble. Reef, I checked to see how much they get paid.
Yeah.
Do you want to know how much they get paid?
$4.50.
Double that.
$8.50. $9.
$9 an hour.
Yeah.
Now, so a 16-year-old goes in this program. Now, because you're 16, you can't work 40 hours. You can work at maximum is 20.
Yeah.
So you're going to make $9 an hour, 20 hours a week for about 6 weeks.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Not doing the math right now, but that's under $1,000 for the summer. And I'm sorry, and just to give you guys context of this, when I was a senior in high school, I worked at the Gap over 2 decades ago. I made minimum wage. At that time in New Jersey, it was $5.45 an hour. Now, because at that time I was 18, I was able to work a 40-hour week. I didn't because I was in school, but I could work as many shifts as they were able to give me. But I was working for $5 an hour. That was over 2 decades ago. Why in the hell are we giving teenagers not much more than the federal minimum wage when the minimum wage in DC is $16 an hour? If they can do the job, why cannot pay them the full 16? No offense, but that is going to give more. And I'm not making fun of this, but I know many teens who know that they're able to make more on the street.
Straight up.
Sorry.
Not even a problem.
Or have to try and find a job at a normal place outside the program, and good luck trying to get one. Especially now that people don't work at malls in the same way anymore. Like, that's what we used to do, like, growing up. Like, your first job was at a mall. No one shops at malls anymore. Now everything is online.
Check out the Dead Mall series on YouTube. Very good.
Right. So it's like, but you expect to pay teens and just make the justification, oh, they'll get out of trouble with $9 an hour.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
So just as an aside, but that's what Allison is saying. It's like, you will spend more money locking them up, but you're not going to invest in actually paying these kids an actual minimum wage so that they would be more likely to do something more productive with themselves. Right?
Yep.
Anyway, if you're willing to spend $88K taxpayer dollars a year detaining each presumptively innocent person held pretrial at DCDOC, but unwilling to inadequately fund pathways, project empowerment, MORCA, and reentry housing, you aren't serious about creating and sustaining public safety in DC.
Yep.
If you were posting Black Lives Matter and offering condolences to Karan Hilton Brown's family, remember we did a segment on him back over the winter, but you support legislation rolling back the modest police accountability measures that may have saved his life, you clearly care more about politics than safety or Black lives. We can't let the politics or fear overpower evidence about what works. Pinto's bill is political theater, and it won't make us any safer. So I'm definitely going to watch this because this will probably affect my activism in the education field in some way,
sure.
shape, or form. And I already talked about this with Scott already. And honestly, I just think it's a huge distraction to kind of talk about safety in light of other issues that are important to teachers.
Yep.
Not to say that it isn't important, but there's going to be a lot of sectionality between of like safety in terms of like schools and what that means as far as ensuring that our youth are being safe in our schools and all that kind of stuff, which relates to a lot of this stuff, especially like if you were in the low income wards. And again, the people who are pushing this, and this is some of the thing, this is something that I mentioned on Twitter to someone on Twitter who was being like, oh, this is such a good thing. How do we know this is going to be equitable in terms of who's going to be in this in pretrial detention? If you're living in the richer wards, you don't have to necessarily worry about that. Or more than likely,
any incarceration to me doesn't help
or
a
given
damn
those
thing.
families, they might do some wiggle room in order to for their children or whoever is involved to get out of it.
Well,
this is a blatant attack.
I also love how they throw in just more security cameras. They just throw that one in, like, okay, and that's to help them catch more crime, to therefore incarcerate more people that don't need, like, that don't really need to be there, regardless of what they've done. You know, like they probably just need help or, again, housing, food, you know, any of those things.
As I said, this is a straight up backlash to the defund the police movement. And
we'll
so
see.
as I said, and I didn't realize the full implications of this until I really studied this, but this is dangerous because if this is, and keep in mind, these are Democrats. These are Democrats that are actually doing this shit.
Isn't it always?
And they move to the right as far as crime.
Yeah.
So what does that tell you?
Democracy simply doesn't work.
I mean, like, what it tells me.
Like, I say this in federal politics, and I will say, and I've
said it before, and I'll say it again.
What? Sorry.
Look, I've said a lot about local politics that, you know, you have more effect, better effect in local politics, and that's where you should focus your energy. But I say that with the caveat of saying, even local politicians are not your friends, right? Just because you might have better access to them and you know them, and like, as I said, I know a couple of them personally, and they all voted for this bill.
You got no friends in Washington, D.C.
So it's the idea of just simply trust no politician, especially given the corruption that exists, even on the local level. Now, DC is a different beast, but the implications are still the same. You know, it's the idea of politicians can be bought and sold and do whatever the corporation or whoever donors that are tied to them, they will do whatever they can, do whatever they need to ensure their jobs and in order to keep those donors happy. But ultimately, this affects our communities of color. And I'm sorry, Zach, but like, as one that knows you, and I practically lived right down the hall from you, the fact that you are more in tune of what is happening in your community and you still choose to vote for this anyway, and then kind of backtrack and kind of say, you know, I did this.
It's only temporary. Right.
This is only a temporary measure, but you can't get rid of it. Will be very hard to get rid of this in any way, shape, or form. Like, once you made it, you know, like, it's in. So it's going to be a lot harder now to kind of take it out. So, but yeah, as I said, this is, I think, and I I wish that on it, and again, this is a local story, but really we all should be talking about this on independent media because this is happening in DC. That's not to say that that can't happen in New York, in Baltimore, in Chicago, in LA, any of these democratic cities where crime is rising, they can essentially do the same thing.
Yep.
You know, so I think it's just something. So consider this, like, for our family here, a cautionary tale of don't expect even your local politicians to work in your favor. You just really need to make sure that you're really on them and ensure that you also are aware of corporate interests, even on the local level, that can affect how people vote, that ultimately affect how people live. And so just be mindful of that, you know, as you do your activism, you know, either whether, you know, here or on Twitter, you know, like, or in your town or whatever. Just be mindful of this, that politicians, more often than not, do not work in your favor. So it's really up to you to make sure that you put your foot on their neck to ensure that they're really working in your favor.
Yep. Well,
you're done. You're done.
Oh god.
I am. So,
but yeah, that surveillance shit in there is also just funny. Speaking of,